Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our presentation. My name is Katie Ensweiler. I'm the marketing manager here at Von Lehman CPA and advisory firm. A few Zoom housekeeping items. If you can, please leave your line on mute. Carl has mentioned that he does want this presentation to be interactive. So if you do have any questions, you are welcome to unmute yourself and open up your camera to ask him your question directly, or you can send it through the chat feature and we can address it as well. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Larry Brown, who is going to thank our sponsors.
Thanks, Katie. My name is Larry Brown, and I lead our financial institutions practice here at Von Lehman. We're CPAs and advisors that help our clients from everything from audit, tax, internal audit, compliance reviews, information technology and security reviews, and a lot more. We're pleased today to have Carl Pry join us and to talk about HMDA as everybody heads into their filing season and some of the changes to the mortgage loan application. Also very pleased to have Doug Ross with us from Data Center Inc. to co-sponsor this event, and we really appreciate it. So I'm going to turn it over to Doug and let him introduce himself as well.
Good morning, and thank you, Von Lehman, Larry, and Katie for pulling this together. Carl for getting up in the wee hours of the morning. You know, many of you know me from my past adventures, and most of you don't know that about 2 months ago I joined DCI or Data Center Inc. I joined them after working on several core consulting engagements and really fell in love with the way they did business. They're owned by a diverse group of banks. They own their software. They're really focused on their partner success as opposed to quarterly earnings. So it's been very exciting change for me. We service core customers anywhere from north of 3 billion down to about 30 million. So if due diligence is on your horizon and you'd like to look at someone that's a little different in the marketplace, please look me up. With that said, I would like to turn things back over to Katie so she can formally introduce Carl and we can get things rolling.
Thanks, Doug. I appreciate it. I'm going to take some time to read through Carl's bio. Carl, while I'm doing that, if you want to work on pulling up your presentation, that would be great. Carl Pry is a seasoned executive with banking law, corporate finance, and regulatory compliance experience in Fortune 500 institutions, regional banks, and industry consulting firms. Carl advises clients on commercial compliance, fair lending, corporate treasury, and risk management. With strong knowledge and experience as a banking attorney and officer, Carl is a frequent contributor and currently serves as the editorial advisory board for the ABA Bank Compliance magazine. As a featured speaker for numerous banking, compliance, and state bar associations, he has led training sessions across the country. Carl has served as an instructor at FDIC Examiner School and backup instructor for NCUA Examiner School. He has authored training programs covering consumer and commercial compliance, audit, quality control, tax, privacy, and risk management. With that, I'll turn it over to Carl.
Thank you, Katie, and thanks to you all for spending a couple hours out of your day to listen to the always interesting compliance issues. And I say that tongue-in-cheek, but there is an awful lot going on right now, and I think we're in for a real roller coaster this year. And I don't just say that because of the political environment, but that certainly is going to contribute to that, but just the environment we're in. And I know most of you are either sitting at your kitchen table or your home office or in a broom closet somewhere, who knows. I'm sitting out here in Arizona, and as I look out my window over here, we actually got snow last night. And I'm not in the Phoenix area. I'm actually about 100 miles north, actually around Sedona, if you've ever been out there. But we had a pretty bad winter storm blow through here last night. And we've got, as I look out, actually the sun is just coming up now. But we actually got about 4 inches of snow, which is very unusual for this area. And moved out here a couple of years ago from Cleveland to get away from all this. And here I am sitting in it again, and got 2 kids in middle school and high school, and they have a snow day, which I haven't experienced in a couple of years. Actually, one of the kids is back in school and the other's not, but they even called off the online school today because most of their teachers had to go in. So it's a pretty bizarro day out here. But anyway, enough about that. But excuse me as I have to keep looking outside as the sun comes up. we're going to spend some time here talking about a couple of topics. We're going to talk about HMDA, and then we're going to talk about the new 1003, or the Uniform Residential Loan Application. And actually, that's where we're going to start. We're going to start with that one because it is new, and the date where it's required is rapidly coming up on us, and it'll impact all of us. So we'll talk about what that means and how you might go about addressing any of the issues. Now, I'm sure you're all aware that this is happening. You're probably well on the way of any type of implementation changes and operational issues that you might have, but we'll go over all the specifics and fill in any of the gaps. We hope that, or I hope that I do that. And in that vein, those of you who have listened to me before know that I'm very informal. So I'm not going to be reading the slides to you. Not going to be reading a chapter and verse of any law or regulation. I'm a practitioner by nature. My day job is a managing director of Treliant, which is a compliance risk management consulting firm out of DC, but obviously we can be anywhere in the country. So I've worked with, literally hundreds of different banks and lenders on HMDA issues and everything else. Meaning I'm more of a practitioner by nature. I'm not a lifelong consultant. I spent a number of years in the banking industry. I worked for about 10 years at KeyBank up in Cleveland. So I know a lot of you are familiar with that. And I was in charge of HMDA for most of that time in the Fair Lending Office. So this is still pretty personal to me. And I remember sitting in the chair that many of you sit in, having that responsibility. And it's coming up on that time of year. We've got about 5 weeks, a little bit less than that, to make sure your submission file is ready to roll and you've got everything in order. So that's really what we're going to do here today is focus on a lot of those problem areas. There's a lot of information we have to cover. Actually, 2 hours is not enough time, or barely enough, to get everything in that we're going to discuss. So I'm going to be going pretty quickly through it. Hopefully you won't get bored with anything that I've got to say here. But I will say, again, in the vein of keeping this informal, if you have questions, please ask. And now is the time, meaning no need to really save everything to the end or anything like that. We set this up. One of the advantages of a Zoom meeting rather than a webinar is you all have the capability to unmute your phone and say, hey, time out, stop for a minute. I've got a question on this. So certainly you have the option to do that. I don't mind at all. A lot of great information comes from the questions that you all have. And honestly, this is more for you than for me. And you don't want to listen to me just preach for a couple hours here. Or go ahead and use the type feature, type in what you have. And Katie will be more than happy to interrupt me by turning her camera on. And if she does that, I know that somebody has typed in a question, and I'll stop at a convenient point when we'll address it right then. So rather than save everything to the end, let's do that. So Katie, I see your face. Is there something that we need to address right away?
Covered everything perfectly. Just wanted to let you know we already have one question. Didn't know if you wanted me to go ahead and throw it out there or wait till you got started.
Yeah, why not? Let's take it now and see where we go.
Perfect. HMDA, report or exclude business purpose loan with a HMDA purpose other.
Exclude. Those are not reportable. And I will show you a little chart in one of the pages coming up where you will see that. So if it's a commercial purpose loan, you're only going to report it if the purpose is home purchase, home improvement, or refinance, as those terms are defined. So we're going to go through all that in turn. So good question, and I'll try to remind myself that is the issue when we come up on it, but we'll cover that. So thanks for that question, and that's what we're going to do. So we'll, if you've got a question, Katie will be more than happy to turn her camera on, and we'll address it right then and there. But time's a wasting, so let's jump right into things here, and let's talk about the new Uniform Residential Loan App, or URLA. I'm not one that says URLA a lot, but certainly a lot of people do say that. So I kind of shorthand that as the 1003, but it's also Form 65. And what I mean by that is if you are a Fannie or Freddie lender, you will use the standard format of the Uniform Residential Loan Application. So that's why I use 1003. And in my experience, that's what most people in the industry call that particular form. So that's what we'll call it here as well. One thing I want to mention is in many of these pages, you will see what is blue and underlined on the page. Now, Katie, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but you've either already sent out the PDF presentation version of this, or you will.
Yep, I
You have
sent it
already?
out this morning, and
Okay.
I'll be sure to send it out in our follow-up email as well in case anyone misplaced it.
Great, great. So hopefully all of you have that. If you don't, I would say text something to Katie, so she's got something to do here while she's trying not to fall asleep during our discussion here. Yeah, I'm joking, Katie, but hopefully you have that. And if you've got the PDF version, anything that's blue and underlined is a website link. I'm a big believer in providing as much source material as is out there. And fortunately, there's an awful lot of stuff. So as we go through this, both on the 1003 as well as HMDA, you're going to see a ton of website links. And for example, the first one there at the top of the page under Uniform Residential Loan app, you click on that, you're going to get the form itself, and you'll see it on the right-hand side of the page. That's where I got it, put the image there on screen. So hopefully it's easier for you rather than having to try to hunt around on the web for all this information. It's right there. So take that PDF and use all those links as you will. One little operational note, people have told me, make sure you open up that file in a PDF reader. So that free Acrobat reader that you can get online, that's the way you can get the links. A lot of banks kind of default their systems to open PDFs in the web browsers, whether it's Chrome or Explorer or something like that. And there's good reason for that. They do it for virus check, that type of thing. But people have told me sometimes the links don't work if you open it up in a web browser. Open it up in a PDF reader, and all of these links will show up. Just put your mouse over it, click away, and you'll go right there. So hopefully that helps you out as we go through this information as well as later. And ideally, this will be a useful document for you rather than just something that you pitch later. Okay, so let's talk about the 1003. If you're a bit unfamiliar with what this form is for or what the chief purpose is, it's really the standardized form that lenders use to submit information to Fannie or Freddie. So if your institution is a Fannie or Freddie lender, you sell loans to them, they have many, many strict requirements as far as how you deliver the information to them and deliver the loan package to them, including the 1003. Now, there's a whole lot more to that than what we're going to talk about today. There are data formats and there are efforts on Fannie and Freddie's part to update that, of which this new 1003 and Form 65 is part. But you don't want to hear me talk about that for 2 hours, and that's really more of an IT effort, and you certainly get enough instruction on that from Fannie and Freddie. But we're going to talk more of the compliance aspects of this new 1003 and really what that means for both compliance professionals as well as lenders. I would expect there are a number of you on the line here as well. Now, one important note, and I hear this question a lot, hey, are we required to use this form? And do we have to use the new form? And what's the deal with what we have to use here? Well, if you are a lender that does sell loans to Fannie and Freddie, you do have to use that form simply because it's their requirement. It's not a compliance rule. Now, the compliance rule that we're concerned with here is Regulation B, ECOA. And that rule says that anytime you take an application for a loan that's secured by the primary dwelling of the applicant, and the purpose is either to purchase or refi that primary dwelling, Reg B requires that you utilize a written application form to collect the application information. Now, that written application form can take basically any form that you want. It can be something that you draft up at your desk. It can be a standard form used by Fannie or Freddie or really anyone else. So even Reg B doesn't require that you use this particular form. Now, it's the easiest form for that use, and it's kind of developed into the industry standard because so many lenders are Fannie and Freddie shops. But if you're not, or even for loans that you don't plan to sell to Fannie and Freddie, meaning your portfolio loans, you're not required in and of itself to use the 1003 or the 65. But again, most lenders do simply because it's easy to train, it can be automated, it's a good form, it has everything you need, and it has the GMI, meaning the government monitoring information. It's got that race, ethnicity, age, all the information that you're required to collect pursuant to Reg B, as well as HMDA. Now, HMDA has no written application requirement. There's nothing I can show you in HMDA that says thou shalt use the 1003 or even thou shalt use a written application form. But so many HMDA loans you have to that are also covered by Reg B, meaning you have to collect certain monitoring information. So it's kind of this mismatch. I should. What am I trying to say? A mashup of different regulatory requirements as well as Fannie or Freddie that result in the 1003 being the standard form. So I just wanted to set that forth right away. If you're wondering, hey, what are the compliance requirements as far as what we have to use this form? There's no federal law or regulation out there that says, hey, you've got to use this 1003 form unless you're a Fannie or Freddie shop, in which case their form is required to be used. So let's talk about what's going on here. We'll talk about the timeframes, and I'll have a lot of graphics for you around that. But remember, we're kind of in this transition period now, and the date that you're required to use that form is coming up pretty quickly. So we are talking about the redesign or the new 1003 or the Uniform Residential Loan Application. This has been a years-long process by both Fannie and Freddie for a number of reasons. Primary among that is the updating of their systems and their process to collect and process information. And kind of the big picture is they are undergoing efforts to attempt to standardize the way mortgage loan information is collected throughout the industry. And I'll have some other resources that you can look at around that later on. But they have been working with the CFPB. They've been working with the other banking regulators, being the OCC, Fed, FDIC, even the NCUA, around establishing a uniform data set. And there are many reasons for that, and some seem kind of George Orwell, the truth be told here. But really what that means for us is the new form is part of a larger effort to kind of standardize mortgage information, and we're all along for the ride to use the new form. But in many ways, the form is a lot easier. And if you take a look at it, if you just go back and if you've downloaded that thing or taken a look at it, and you kind of take that 10,000-foot approach to it, it looks an awful lot like a form that the CFPB would have kicked out. It looks like the new loan estimate. It kind of looks like the CD, those TRID forms that we're all, of course, very fond of. And I definitely say that sarcastically here, but that's on purpose. So there's a lot of white space. The typeface is intentionally set to look like a lot of those mortgage forms. And both Fannie and Freddie said that's why we've done this. So it looks like a mortgage form, and it kind of fits into the larger puzzle of that. Now, this is also part and parcel of the larger automated underwriting system, or AUS, capabilities of both Fannie and Freddie. And those of you that are participating in their programs here are certainly more than familiar with either DU or LP. So Fannie Mae's desktop underwriter program, as well as Freddie's loan prospector, the underwriting engines to consider whether that is a loan that Fannie or Freddie would purchase, and drives many of your decisions. So that has to be part and parcel of that particular program. So what are some of the enhancements? What are some of the changes of the form? Now you can read these for yourselves. Like I mentioned, the type is bigger. There's white space. It looks like some of the TRID documents. So there's additional contact information. And frankly, the form has just been updated. There's new information on there. It's been made easier. And there are some supplements in this form as well to really make the structure of the loan easier to understand. We'll go through that and I'll explain that as time goes on here. And ideally, it provides clarity, particularly for multiple borrowers. And I could go off on a rant and talk about fair lending on the basis of marital status and some of the issues that arise there. But sometimes it's difficult to determine whether the spousal information is required, and that's a problem with regard to Reg B. And it's easier to determine a multiple borrower situation when you have that information split out as it is now. So that was one of the driving purposes behind the redesign form as well. So there are a number of benefits, and you can read those for yourselves, but I honestly think that this is an improvement. It's always an issue to implement changes and go through the operational issues that occur during this. But in the end, the new form will be easier to understand and basically utilize. Now, looking at the bottom of the page, and that little arrow is off to the right-hand side of the page, a couple of graphics that I liberally borrowed from the GSE's website here. But one important thing you'll notice that there is no borrower and co-borrower information on there. And that really is reflective of the issue that I brought up a moment ago, the spousal signatures, and the fact that it may be difficult to determine whether a lender required the spouse to come in And there is, the innocent spouse doctrine. Again, I could go off at length, and I've got to control myself in that. But rather than a co-borrower situation, we just have one or more borrowers. Makes it a little bit easier to understand. And you have additional borrower components, and we'll talk about where those are and what those look like here to streamline the information that you need to collect if you have an additional borrower, and rather than the co-borrower, which a lot of people confuse as the guarantor. So a lot of issues that they're trying to straighten out as far as that goes. So next up here, there is new information on the form that I mentioned. You'll have to excuse me, and I apologize for the type being as small as it is. And myself, I've got to put on my little cheaters that I always have laying around the house to read some of that. I am of that age now where I need to see up close with glasses here. But for example, there is a new section 4 on the form that deals with loan and property information. And as you can see, there's 3 new sections around subordinate liens and rental income and gifts and grants. And I've kind of shorthanded that, but the red box that I put around that graphic on the right-hand side of the page is something I put on there rather than on the form itself. So you can see what is new. The good news is these agencies, Fannie and Freddie, have just a ton of resources on their site. And they've got a lot of information that you can link to and see what they've done with regard to this form. And I'll show you where all those links are later. But they do a very good job of explaining what is new and exciting and different around that form. So you can be sure to take a very close look and determine, is that information we don't currently have at our disposal? We need to change a process in order to obtain that information. Really makes the change management process a lot easier. Another change is in many sections, they put that little does not apply checkbox on the top of the form. That is particularly useful because as you're going through these applications, as far as a QC review or you're auditing, or, God forbid, an examiner starts questioning and they take a look at the form and you see a form or a provision or a section of the form that's not filled out at all. And somebody asks you, hey, did somebody forget something? Should this be completed? And somebody just missed it. You've got an operational problem going on here. But the fact is, well, no, it's just not necessary. And rather than, put a big X on it with a Sharpie or, just explain that, hey, it's not necessary here. Excuse me, I'm trying to hold back a sneeze. So I'll mute myself before I blow everybody's speakers out here. But there's this does not apply box on there, which becomes very useful because you can determine, every section of the form was looked at, and those that are not applicable, you just click the do not apply box or check the box if you're printing the thing out. Makes it a little bit easier. So one of those little improvements, I believe, that will become very useful. Now, there are instruction documents available for each field on the form. Now, one thing that I was really unable to do, or just I didn't do on this document here, is there are pretty much parallel links for both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. You'll notice on the very first page, I linked to both the 1003 and the Form 65, depending on whether you are a Fannie or a Freddie shop. Now, the good news is all of this information is available on either of their sites. I linked to one or the other. And in many cases, the documents that you'll see are identical, like these instruction forms. Like you see, the instruction here has both Fannie and Freddie's logo at the top. And if you linked to them through either of their sites, you're going to get the same document here. But this is really your change management document, not just for compliance, but for IT and operationally. And you're wondering, well, what does this form mean on the 1003? This is where you go. Make sure you download this and really use this for change management in that, well, this is information that we don't currently collect or we don't have it in the proper format. This is your roadmap to making sure that you get everything that you need. And they do a pretty good job in providing all the information that you need on that. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are additional forms. The 1003 and the 65 are not necessarily only standalone documents. There are additional documents that may be necessary or relevant depending on the situation of the loan. They have the continuation sheet, which is basically just a blank form with those larger free form fields, what you see in purple on that if you're completing it online, where anything that doesn't fit on the basic 1003 form, you would put it on there and just include it in the package. And printed out or stored electronically. There's an unmarried addendum form here, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail coming up. But as I take a look here, and some of you may need to do the same thing to stare at your screen here, you see the instructions to the lender for using them, and then you see the situation where you would check the box to make the assertions on an unmarried co-applicant or co-borrower, as the case may be. And then you've got another form, lender loan information. So this is really the kind of worksheet and kind of the transmittal sheet, if you will, that becomes very useful to us as lenders to determine and document what type of loan we're talking about here. So rather than have something, scribbled down on a blank sheet of paper in the loan file, if you're storing this electronically, it's more or less a document that makes it very easy to demonstrate the specifics around the form. You've got property and loan information, you've got title information in the middle there to really differentiate the types of loans that you have and products and so forth. So I think that's a particularly useful form. Familiarize yourself with that as well and just make life easier as far as that goes. So then the question becomes, well, what form do we have to use? We've got all this information that you're telling me about here. How do we know which form we have to use in which situation? Now, that becomes very important if you are a Fannie or Freddie lender and you have to deliver the package to them. And I'm sure you've been busy at work to determine what forms and how to submit them and changes to their process to get the package to Fannie or Freddie. But maybe you're a lender that's just using these because they're the easy forms to use, and you're trying to figure out, well, what are the requirements as far as what we have to use here? Well, the easy part is if you've only got one applicant, I come into your shop and apply for a loan to either buy my home, or maybe it's home equity loan or refi, that type of thing. Well, you just use that borrower form. No more do we see those double columns and you only fill out one. You would just use this form, have me fill it out or fill it out for me, and off you go. And that leads to a question. Hey, is this something that we can fill out on behalf of our applicant here? Can I call you on the phone, and as we go through the fields, you fill it out either on paper or electronically? And the answer is sure. Reg B doesn't require that I fill it out. And as a matter of fact, it doesn't even require that I sign it. That's not a requirement of either Reg B or HMDA. That's more of a procedural and best practice type of issue, but certainly you could fill it out for me. I could call Katie up and she could lead me through it and fill it out on her system as we go through these issues here. One of the more interesting things around this age of COVID-19 and what we've gone through the past year, can you believe it's almost been a year since we've been dealing with this thing here, is the real advancements in electronic capability. It's really pushed us as an industry at light speed towards the capability to conduct business electronically. And now we have the ability to close loans entirely electronically. You may never see me, or you may never see me face to face, much less on a Zoom meeting. And we have things like what we call remote online notarization. Don't even need me to show up in front of the notary. I don't need to get in my car and go to the title company. And this is just part of that process here. And I know many institutions, maybe some of you here on the line today, are struggling with that, or maybe enjoying that, making life easier for your lenders here. This is just part of that process. Next up, if you have joint applicants, so you've got two applicants with joint financial information, the typical husband and wife situation, you've got a choice. You can complete the borrower and the additional borrower form, so you would have two as part of the package. Or you complete that separate borrower form, but you would report the jointly owned or reported assets, liabilities, and so on, I should say, on only one of the forms. Now, if they're not collaborating when they're completing the application here, you may duplicate that on the form. So it makes it easy because there are some flexibilities as far as how you would do that. But it does make a little bit more sense as you really dig into the form and see where this information is. In my opinion, at least, it certainly makes it a lot easier. If you've got two applicants with separate financial information, so you've got two unrelated applicants or non-married individuals, again, you've got a choice. You can complete the borrower and the additional borrower form and report the information for each of them on the borrower form, or have a separate form for each. So totally up to you here. If you're a Fannie or Freddie shop, they provide those options for producing the package and sending it to them. If you're not a Fannie and Freddie shop and you're just using these because they're easy, certainly you've got the flexibility to do what you want. If you've got 3 or more separate applicants, you can combine and do whatever is easiest for you. So that flexibility is certainly welcome. All right. There's some additional shared information on these forms here that you see on page 10. And if it's more convenient, if you've got borrowers that are sharing liabilities and assets, again, that married applicant situation, you can use that additional borrower form to avoid duplicating everything. And really that was one of the complaints and recommendations to Fannie and Freddie as they went through this multi-year process to develop the new forms. So you've got the potential here, the option to have the additional forms filled out by those borrowers. And you can see the numbers of the section of the form. I didn't make a mistake here, and PowerPoint didn't mess up my numbering. These are the sections of the 1003 that indicate, for example, section 7 for military information on the form itself. And then you've got the option for additional borrowers to indicate their assets, liabilities, all their information on the 1003 by that joint borrower. So in the end, there is the option to do this in any way that works best for you, and hopefully that becomes an easier process as time goes on and we all get used to the new form. All right, so I mentioned there's a lot of great information on these websites, and both of the GSEs, government-sponsored enterprises, if you're unfamiliar with that abbreviation, just refers to Fannie and Freddie. But here is their master URLA websites, and I've got the links for both of them here and just took a little screenshot and put it on screen. But here's where you can find all the good stuff that they've had, I should say, to support their new application forms. So there are links to reference guides and quick reference guides and checklists, FAQs. I'm a huge fan of FAQs because they get very specific and really address some of the gray areas and things that are vague around these. And actually some videos. There's a good training video out there as well. So I would certainly bookmark the one or both of these pages, depending on which you find easier to navigate, or if you sell to either Fannie or Freddie. And again, the information there is virtually identical. They very closely collaborated on this project. So the 1003 and the 65 form look identical, and all of the instructions and information is the same. So that's why I've got links for one or both as we go forward. So all these links you can find or get to from that master page from either Fannie or Freddie. But I just kind of cataloged here some of the easier to find resources. So you could use this PDF form as kind of your master link document to find all this good stuff, but it's all on those sites as well. But there's what I call what they call, I should say, the announcements index. And this is where they have posted all of their news releases and updates as we get closer to the implementation date. Any changes that they have made or announcements that they want to make, they index those and put them all in one place. So that may be a good place to look. There's the fact sheet, which I always love those. It's kind of like an executive summary or a quick guide to understand what's going on. I linked to Fannie Mae's in this instance here. I like this next one, the readiness checklist. And as we come up very quickly to the implementation date, you want to make sure that you are fully ready, and maybe you've forgotten something, and maybe there's something that you need to do, whether it's IT related or operational. The readiness checklist would be a good resource there. They also have links if you provide information to the limited English proficiency or LEP consumers out there. And that is a very relevant topic. If you're unfamiliar with LEP and what the CFPB has to say about it, just within the past couple weeks, there was a major issuance from the CFPB around LEP and non-English individuals. So I would certainly urge you to take a look at that. But the information as far as the application form goes is available in other languages on both Fannie and Freddie's sites. You can get the current, or what we're going to call very shortly the old form, if you want to take a look at that, as well as what we call a numbered form, which I just put a picture of over on the right-hand side of the page, that will correspond to all of the system requirements and so forth, so you can map. So this is a great data map document to ensure that you've got everything that you need. So they've really done a good job, in my opinion, of providing the information that you will need to make sure that it is a smooth transition to the new form. Here's a link to that training video that you might want to take a look at and see if it's worthwhile to to broadcast on your bank's intranet site, or maybe have people that are more involved in that process take a look at. So there's the link directly there. Again, these you can all be found through the URLA websites that both Fannie and Freddie have, but I just put that link there if you want to cut the corner. This document is also extremely useful in my opinion, and you click on that link and you're going to download the spreadsheet. So you may have to go through your bank's IT department to be able to access that with regard to privacy and so forth. But once you go over that hurdle and you're able to open this thing, this is what you're going to get. And it's a comparison against the old or existing 1003 to the new form. And this is an extremely valuable document. Again, it's a great data map, and it may be something that your IT department and operations take a look at. Katie, what you got?
Okay, new 1003. Is this correct that the loan officer has to sign a section 9 for each borrower on the loan? The example being 3 borrowers equals 3 loan officers sign section 9S.
So let's take a look at section 9, and we have that the loan originator information. Well, the loan originator information, that actually comes from the SAFE Act, and putting that MLO indicator and all that in there. You don't necessarily have to indicate that for each individual borrower. That information is a per loan field there. Now, can you do it for each? Sure, but it's not a requirement, say, for each individual one. All right, let's see, where were we here? Oh yeah, the spreadsheet. And these are color coded as well to indicate which fields are new, which have changes, which are a direct map from the old to the new, that type of thing. So you might want to take a look at that. And I think it's a good kind of 11th hour document to make sure that you've just got all your ducks in a row and you understand exactly what's going on with regard to each of the fields here. By the way, it occurred to me that I should have mentioned when we had that question, Katie, and let me go back here real quick. I believe I put my email address should be somewhere. And Katie, take a look at the document here and make sure I put it there somewhere. I think I did. If I haven't, I want to make sure I provide it to you here. If you have any questions that come up later, want to have a resource that you can drop me a line and ask away. So we'll have to take a look at that. I'm not remembering if I put in my email address on there. Okay, so there's also another. I'm sorry, go ahead,
Carl.
Katie.
I was just going to say, we have it on your document, but then I'll also pull it out and set it in the email as well, so it's very easy for our attendees to find.
Very good, thanks, Katie. Yeah, I want to make sure that you've got a resource to send questions that you have later, or something that you don't want to bring up in front of the hundreds of people listening here today. You get my drift. So certainly there is help available. I'm more than happy to help with regard to anything that you may have later on. Now, can you modify the form? So it's great that we've got this form here. It looks pretty cool and everything, but can I make changes to it? You know, can I take a little editorial license? Can I maybe put my bank logo on it, or, you know, provide a little bit of customization of the form? And the answer is maybe. There's a document out there called the rendering options that you can download, and I blew up a part of that. And this particular document has all the options that you can reformat, redesign, or customize the form if you want. And it answers the question, if you are a Fannie or Freddie shop, what you're permitted to do and still be in compliance with their requirements, meaning Fannie or Freddie's requirements to accept delivery of the package here. So that's a valuable document as well. Now, in the end, if you're not a Fannie or Freddie shop and you're just listening today because you use the form, but you don't sell loans to Fannie or Freddie, you could pretty much do what you want. You know, Reg B just says, hey, you have to have a written application form for these types of loans, but it doesn't say exactly what it has to look like. It doesn't mandate the use of the URLA. But of course, you got to be careful from a compliance perspective that you don't ask questions that you shouldn't from a fair lending perspective. But there are options to modify certain fields of the form, and I would recommend downloading that document to see what they have to say about it. Now, if you've been monitoring this issue for a number of years, you may be asking about, what about this whole preferred language issue? And a very short history of what's going on. A few years ago, it was proposed that Fannie and Freddie would put a little field on the form where the borrower would either enter or check what their preferred language was. Was it English, or was it Spanish, or Mandarin, or French, or whatever the case may be? And there were some fairly strong, let's just say, recommendations from the CFPB and certainly members of Congress and so forth, that we need to take some extra steps to ensure that everybody has the best experience. And you're not discriminated against because English is not your first language. And this is really at the same time this whole LEP initiative developed throughout the system. The acronym LEP, Limited English Proficiency, was really developed by HUD, and they were the first ones that came out with it, but now you see it all over the place. And as time has gone on, Fannie and Freddie have gone back and forth as they've issued various drafts of the forms. Some had it on there, then they took it off, and then they put it back on. Now, speaking as a compliance person here and somebody who has dealt with fair lending for years, this issue concerned me greatly, and I'm sure you all had your own reservations around this. And my problem with it was not so much that it was on there. I mean, I'm all for making the process easier for applicants and borrowers, but what happens if my bank is not prepared to offer loans in Spanish or in Mandarin or anything else here? And all of a sudden, I give somebody a loan, they have checked the box that says Spanish is my preferred language. Does that then impose a requirement on me as the borrower to deliver information in Spanish? After all, that's what the borrower has indicated, that's what they would prefer. And, you know, God forbid, worst case scenario, that loan goes into defaults, and now the borrower has a basis to sue me as a lender because they say, well, geez, they sold me a bill of goods here. And they clearly knew that I didn't understand that information because they delivered everything in English. And right there on the form is where I've checked that I prefer Spanish. So it's really the lender's fault that I have this loan and I didn't understand it, and now it's in default, and we can go into ability to repay issues, all that type of thing. In other words, it kind of increased the temperature, increased legal risk, in my opinion. And a lot of people had the same reaction to this. And the thought process was, well, if you're not going to mandate that we deliver information like disclosures and legal documents in any other language but English, why have this information on here? And ultimately, Fannie and Freddie and their regulator, the FHFA, the Federal Housing Finance Authority, agreed. So I've got some information on here. They did address it in the Q&A document number 3. So why was it not on there? Why did they remove it? And they talked about the fact that the relevance of that and the requirement, they're kind of dancing around it. Now, I don't mean to be political here at all, but we are certainly in a new age, and the next 2, if not 4 years, are going to be particularly interesting to those of us that deal with compliance and bank law. And we know the enforcement environment is going to change. We're going to go back to what we had prior to the Trump administration, and fair lending has already been targeted and mentioned by the Biden campaign as well as CFPB as one of their focal points for enforcement. So you can certainly expect a lot of action in the fair lending environment. And the question arises, well, might this be the last word on the issue? So might they reissue a new form with this box on there? And the answer is, who knows? At this point, anything is possible. So I don't think they're necessarily done with this, but at least for the time being, we don't have to worry about it. So if you're worried about, well, are there any new responsibilities? Do we have to deliver this in Spanish? The answer is no way, at least not yet. There is no preferred language box on the form that we have to use. So let's put that to bed for now. So let's talk about the when. So we've talked about the what, and there's a lot of information out there. Hopefully you feel more comfortable that you can find what you need as far as what might be missing. I would have loved to go through the form field by field and really try to put you to sleep, use my best efforts there, but we only have 2 hours, and rarely would anybody agree that 2 hours is not enough for compliance, but you get my drift here. So that's why I provided all the links to the information useful to you later. So there was an announcement extending the implementation date. Like I mentioned, this was a multi-year process to develop this form. And it used to be the case that November of last year was the red letter date. We had all circled that on our calendars and we were working to that date, but that was pushed back to March because of COVID-19, as well as some system readiness and other issues here. But March 1st, so we're coming up on about 5 weeks from now, as the magic date. And what Fannie and Freddie have said is that after that date, no previous versions of the application form will be accepted. So that means that you may have to implement that now, if not already, depending on how long it takes to process an application and underwrite it and get that package ready to send to Fannie or Freddie. What they have not said is if application forms were, let's say, accepted on February 15th, but submitted to them on March 10th, would you take the old form? They said no, no. So this thing has been around and in development for years. All the information is freely available. So make sure you know that if the package has a potential of going to Fannie or Freddie after March 1st, that you're using that new form with your applicant right now. You want to make sure that you make it as easy on yourself as you possibly can here. Now, remember, if you're not a Fannie or Freddie shop and you're not delivering loans to them, doesn't matter. You can use the old form, you can use the new forms. It's your own internal preference or policy and procedure here. But this is what Fannie and Freddie say as far as submission to them. Now, the form was technically effective January 1st, even though the requirement date, so to speak, is March 1st. So they said effective January 1, you may use the new form. So you can start sending the new form to Fannie and Freddie right now. And you've been able to for the past 3+ weeks. So I put a couple quotes as far as the production period and development timeline. Last year, at the end of last year, there was a temporary kind of a sandbox environment, if you will, set up, and you could register for that and start delivering the new packages. Not going to talk a lot about that because we're just coming up on the mandated date right quick. So there's plenty of information around the timelines. And I put a couple graphs that you can certainly download from their sites as well. Apologies if they're a little blurry here on screen. But this form has been updated, especially when the COVID-19 delay from November to this coming March was introduced. So make sure you're looking at the current version of the form. And the red stars on there, they put on there rather than me. So they've got all the information on there and they've got that transition period. And here's another version that Fannie Mae had as well to take a look at what you have to do and when. So that should be pretty helpful. And of course, we're coming up on it pretty quickly. All right. I mentioned earlier that this is part of a larger effort that Fannie and Freddie had. And just like the 1003, there's a lot of information on their sites as far as what these programs are all about. And there's a lot of acronyms. So if you're not really familiar with what's going on, you may have to learn a few new ones. It seems like in compliance, we just live in a world of acronyms and abbreviations. But as part of their Uniform Mortgage Data Program, that's the overall umbrella of what they've got going on here, to standardize the data set, easier for the industry to exchange information. So they're working very closely with the CFPB and the banking regulators, and they want to unify this information as much as possible. And a few years ago, and really it's more than a few, like 7 or 8 years ago now, the CFPB had launched an initiative to standardize all information with regard to loans, not just mortgage loans. And their objective was to kind of formulate something like this UMDP for everything. And that way they could conduct audits remotely. And it was kind of a very scary prospect that a lot of us were thinking about. Obviously, with the changes in administration and technology always works much more quickly than does compliance in the law. That effort is kind of bogged down a little bit, but Fannie and Freddie are still at work, and they're very interested in standardizing with regard to the MISMO standards. And you see that right in the middle of the page, version 3.4. That's kind of the organization, the standardization organization, if you will, for this type of information. Ton of information if you want to link to that and just Google it and read if you want. But there are some mapping documents to that data set as well. So that may be relevant for you depending if you're a Fannie or Freddie shop to make sure that you meet all their requirements. So what do we do now? I've just got a little checklist here as we are in the 11th hour for implementation of this new form. I'm not going to read these to you. Hopefully this is a useful set of questions to you and recommendations of, oh yeah, I guess we're coming up on it. We've got to make sure that we've got all the updated documentation. We review with staff, we do some training, whatever the case may be, to ensure that you are fully ready, certainly by the time March 1st rolls around, or if you're going to deliver any package to Fannie or Freddie after March 1st. And remember, if you're not a Fannie or Freddie shop, you can basically do what you want. But if this is all out there and you've got all the information, might as well play along with everyone else. All right. So that was a little bit longer than I intended to spend on the 1003, but that's okay. And there's a lot of information out there, and hopefully I answered a few of the questions that you may have had. So I'm going to pause and take a breath. Katie, how are we doing? Has anybody typed anything in, or any questions that we have hanging out there?
We're doing great. No, we're all caught up on questions. I think you're answering everybody's questions as you go. So well done.
Okay, well, appreciate that. But if nothing else, hey, you've got all the links there, and anything that I didn't address here is likely in one of those documents or links. And if you can't find it there, again, feel free to email me, and I'll be happy to block your email, just like I've tried to block Katie's. I'm kidding here, but yeah, more than happy to help. All right, so let's use our remaining, and I'm sitting out here in Arizona, and I keep looking over there. That's where the clock that I have, so don't mean to be rude on that, but it drives me crazy out here. One of the things that is very odd about Arizona is the fact that we don't change our clocks out here. So we don't spring forth in the spring and turn the clocks back in the fall, which drives me crazy. And I would just prefer that, hey, everybody in the country, either everybody change their clocks or everybody not. Because half the year we're on mountain time, which we are right now, and the other half of the year we're on Pacific time. So sometimes I'm 2 hours behind you, sometimes I'm 3 hours behind. So I actually have 4 clocks on the wall that I'm looking at here, because I gotta make sure I know what time the meeting starts out there in the east or wherever you happen to be. I know you're not interested in that, but it drives me crazy. So I gotta make sure I'm on the right time frame here. So we've got a little bit more than an hour and 5 minutes to talk about HMDA. There are a lot of things we could talk about. And I've done quite a few all-day HMDA training sessions where we really dive deeply into HMDA, talk about the various data fields, where some of the issues are, covers that type of thing. Obviously, we're not going to do that, but I'm a big believer in providing you as much information as possible so that you can take a look at it later, rather than just put a few pages and going deeply into that. Want to make sure you get as much out of this session as possible, and that means more than just the 2 hours we have together. So again, I provide a ton of website links in here to get all the information you might need with regard to HMDA. Now, one thing the CFPB has done very well, and they get a lot of flack for a lot of the things that they do, and some, if not a lot of it, is deserved. But one thing they do very well, and much better than any of the other regulators, is provide a lot of tools and guidance around the regulations that they have oversight over, including HMDA. So they've got a ton of stuff like Fannie or Freddie, FAQs and videos and webinars and executive summaries, all kinds of stuff that I put as many links as I could find on here that I think are helpful. But you can find all this stuff for yourselves, of course, but hopefully I made it a bit easier. So I've just got a list of resources for a couple pages here where you can find a lot of these very helpful tools on your own, and maybe cut the corner so you're not doing a lot of Google searches. But I'm starting with, of course, the HMDA Bible. So those of us that live HMDA day in and day out, you have this on your desktop. You probably printed it out. You've got it dog-eared and highlighted and flagged, the Getting It Right guide. And I've got the most current version of that with the link here, and I've got the little screenshot on the right. The CFPB did do a pretty good job of updating it. They kind of dragged their feet for a while, but now they've gotten their act together, in my opinion. So make sure you have that, if nothing else. And it's got kind of layman's terms of a lot of this information. It's got the reg, the appendices, the commentary, the FIG, the filing instructions guide. So I've got all that stuff in it. Make sure you have that. Now, secondly, at the FFIEC, I've linked to their formatting tool for the LAR, or Loan Application Register, if you're a very small lender and you are doing this yourself. In other words, you're not using a submission tool. You're not using Fair Lending Wiz or CRA Wiz. You're not using Fair Lending Magic, any of the many systems that have been out there for years. I've used probably every one of them under the sun. Full disclosure, Treliant bought one of the vendors a number of years ago, so I'm very familiar with Risk Exec, if you've ever used that platform. So I could talk at length about any of those, and I just say that. So if you're in the market of looking for one of these tools and you want an an opinion of what ones are good and which ones are not. And by the way, Risk Exec is now independent of Treliant, so I have no stake in the game per se as far as that goes. So I'm more than happy to talk about submission tools if you're ever interested later. I've helped many a bank in their vendor selection process. But if you want to do it yourself, there's the LAR formatting tool to submit it electronically to the regulators. I mentioned the FIG, that we appropriately call this document the Filing Instructions Guide. And they have this for data that you collected last calendar year, 2020, that you are busy formatting and getting your submission file ready in the end of next month in 2021. So this is more or less your document to ensure all the fields are completed properly. So how many decimal points and where do we put NA and what do we leave blank, all that kind of good stuff, that is in the FIG. So you make sure that you have that one as well. If you are a large volume filer, and part of what the Dodd-Frank did to amend HMDA that was kind of cemented back in 2018 was to require large filers, meaning having more than 60,000 entries per year, to file quarterly. Now that has been temporarily delayed because of the pandemic, but eventually at some point in time, whenever we get back to normal, and I put that in quotes because who knows what the new normal is going to look like, large filers will be required to begin filing quarterly. So I linked to the supplemental quarterly reporting guides for those of you, if there are anybody that has to file quarterly. All right. So the good news is for this go around, at least this year, there's no major changes, really no changes at all to the file format. And you say, well, thank goodness we got enough on our plate with what's going on over the last year to deal with any major technology changes. So there aren't any, but make sure you have the most current version of the form. This one here on page 26, this is really one of my favorites. Now it is part of the Getting It Right guide, so you'll find it in there, but I've got a link to the latest version of their reference chart. And I know it's kind of hard to see, and I'm going to put on my little cheaters here to kind of go through this. But I really like this because it's kind of a comprehensive look of everything that you have to worry about with regard to HMDA, all of the data fields. So if you look at the far left on this document, you've got the particular data point, you've got the reference to that section in the HMDA regulation itself, and it's blue underlined. Guess what? It's a website link. So you could click on that and you'll go right to that part of the HMDA regulation, and you can read all about what the LEI, the legal entity identifier, is all about. It describes it. It has the filing instructions as far as what you put and where you put it. And then it has that column on the right if you enter NA or whatever the case may be. So this is really where everything is condensed together. And if nothing else, this should be your data mapping document. And I know a lot of banks, and I've helped some banks convert this document into a great big spreadsheet, and that add additional columns as far as where your bank gets it and where it's stored, maybe the system of record, and map it eventually to your submission file, maybe through the software, that type of thing. So extremely helpful resource there. If you don't have this one, make sure you download it and become familiar with it. Now, all this stuff is available on the HMDA resource page that the CFPB has. So I've linked to that. Make sure you click on it, bookmark it, always pay attention to this. By the way, they have these for a lot of different rules, like you see on the left-hand side of the web page there for the ATR and the QM rule, as well as TRID and all your other favorites there. And just as an aside, there's a lot of changes going on in the QM environment that are also going to take effect March 1st. And as a matter of fact, I'm putting on a webinar this afternoon around all the new QM rules that are kicking in or already have kicked in. But certainly I mention that because, click on that link and read all the resources that the Bureau has posted with regard to ATR and QM under Regs 8. But here's the link to the master HMDA webpage that you can get a hold of and find all that good stuff. Now, further, there is information on the HMDA data that has been previously released. And if you look at this little image on the bottom right, you see all of the Federal Reserve bulletins for older HMDA data and the analysis and reports that have been issued. A gentleman by the name of Glenn Canner from the Fed has been writing these for years. He's kind of the godfather of HMDA analysis and reports from the regulatory perspective. He moved to the CFPB, so he still authors these and is in charge of that with the CFPB. But for those of us that are fair lending professionals, and it's great that we're in charge of HMDA submission and all that, but what do you do after March 1st? Now you got to start analyzing, and now you have to start paying attention to how your bank looks and where are the focal points and your disparities and root cause and all that good stuff that we do from a fair lending perspective. Well, part of that is comparing our performance against the industry or that of our peers. So we have to get a hold of all that information online. Fortunately, it is easy to get. So from the overall macro perspective, here's where you can go to find the industry information on that data link page. Other information you see here on page 29, the CFPB has a FAQ document that they periodically update. It's very helpful in my opinion. So a lot of questions that they get, they will just turn around and post on that FAQ. They have posted the FIG for 2021. So of course, we are 3 weeks into the new year. So you're collecting data for applications that you've received this year that you're going to have to report in 2022. So they've got that guidance document out as well. Again, no significant changes. They're certainly holding off because people have better things to do than mess around with operational changes in this age of Corona. Certainly difficult to meet in meeting rooms and go over these things when we're all scattered all through the country here, but fortunately they haven't made any wholesale changes. And then there is the supplemental quarterly reporting guide link there again, so you make sure you have that if that applies to you. Here is the FFIEC's site to everything that was resulting from the 2019 data. Again, this is more useful to the fair lending professional. Now, certainly it's relevant to those of us that deal with the operational impacts of HMDA. But if you're looking for all the industry information and the data sets and the reports and getting your peers or competitors' public HMDA data to do your redlining and peer analysis, here's where you can go. It's all available on that FFIEC website. So I've got all the links that you may need. There's certainly more out there, but again, to make it easy, I just put kind of a master page where you can get all this information around what was submitted in 2019. Obviously, the last year that was available. Just kind of listing here on page 31 as far as some of the observations industry-wide that were observed by the regulators and the CFPB, as well as all the other regulators, member of the FFIEC. I'm going to be really interested to see what comes out for 2020 and what has happened in the industry. And I believe, just cross my fingers, we'll see if I'm right here. And if I'm wrong, I'll deny ever having said it. But I expect the decrease in applications to be not as great as many of us would expect. Now we'll see how we do on that here, but the industry certainly didn't slow down and rates continue to drop. It's unbelievable that you can get a mortgage loan with rates that start with a 2. And I've even seen some that start with a 1, and that's just crazy. And certainly from a P&L perspective, it's frustrating to mortgage lenders because you're not going to make a whole lot of money on it. And how do you manage the financial capacity of your portfolio? But I digress. But this is a good document where you can see what has happened from the industry side of the game. And it's always, again, useful to compare your performance against that of the industry, because rest assured, your regulator is doing that as well. And it'll be part of how they select various issues for your next fair lending exam. All right. So there's the CFPB analysis. Previous was the FFIEC analysis of that. So you can see what the CFPB observed there, and they have grouped the information in 7 categories there and provided a lot of the output and observations that they have seen. Again, very useful to the fair lending professional. All right, so let's spend just a little bit of time on the updates to the new reporting thresholds. Now, I'm going to make the probably dangerous assumption that you wouldn't be listening here today if you weren't already a HMDA reporting institution. So you say, well, we already know we have to report, so I don't need to hear for a half hour what about the threshold, because we're already over the wall, so to speak. We're already reporting. But there may be a few of you that are on the line, or you're fairly small lenders, or you don't collect a number of these applications, and you may be on the line. You're reporting now, or you're wondering whether you have to, and that's why you've logged on here today. So I did put all the information in here, but I'm going to go through it pretty quickly and invite any of you that are in the situation where that's really what you logged on here today to hear about. And you want to be sure you know whether you have to report or not. If I go through this too quickly, be sure to give me a call later, drop me a line. I'm happy to give you a call back and walk you through it or help you to understand whether you have to report or not and go through some of these requirements. But I would expect that a good 97% of you already know you have to report. You've done it for years, so you don't need to hear about the thresholds. But here's the information anyway, because it's changed over the last couple of years. Dodd-Frank made changes. The Dodd-Frank reform package in 2018 made some changes. There have been final rules issued. So you see a couple things going on. Number one is, well, are you even subject to HMDA at all? Do you have to record and submit that information and have a LAR in the first place? Here is the threshold for that. So in other words, are you even in the door for even having to listen to this stuff here today? And that same 25 or 500 threshold is in place that was in there last year as well. Understand that that open-end threshold is going to drop to 200 beginning 1/1 of 2022. So we're in the last year for that. And we'll talk about how that works here. Certainly that reporting thresholds or coverage thresholds, I should say, that's been in existence since HMDA was drafted. The asset size and in an MSA, that must be met as well. That was not done away with. But as far as that institutional coverage, I have all the links there to the latest and greatest. So the final rule, the press release, as well as the Federal Register issuance, those are separate. You can link to those. That extended that 200 to 500 open-end threshold for another year until the beginning of 2022. The CFPB's press release that they issued back in May, as well as their proposals for later changes to the data that we report under HMDA. In other words, we had a lot of changes that took effect in 2018 and essentially doubled the amount of information we have to report under HMDA. And a lot of work was done. And I'm sure a lot of you remember with fond memories, a lot of those late nights and meetings trying to get all that new data corralled and reported and submitted. But now that we're 2-3 years away from that, and hopefully that's working like clockwork at your institution, the CFPB is coming back and asking, you know what, is that really worthwhile information? Do we need to make further changes and maybe tweak, if not eliminate some of those data fields? So they're not done yet. So some of these data fields might get changed. Now, the good news is they're not going to change anything in the next 5 weeks here. But as time goes on, and maybe later this year, and certainly with the new administration, and now we have new leadership coming in to the CFPB, I certainly do not expect any data elements to go away. If we had a continuation of the previous administration for another 4 years, the odds that some of these data elements would have been eliminated was much, much higher. But I don't expect to see any of these things go away. But the only thing we know for sure is that nobody knows. So hold on and let's go for the ride here. So some other issues down to the bottom of page 35, the old Explorer tool and the API for the data platform disappeared from the CFPB's website. And this caught a lot of people's attention, including some in Congress. And now the incoming Finance Committee Chairman, Sherrod Brown. And interesting story, Sherrod Brown is from Ohio, as am I. And Sherrod Brown is from Northwest Ohio, which is where I'm originally from. Here's my contact with greatness, as you might consider this. When I was a little kid, Sherrod Brown family actually babysat me. So that was maybe my first exposure to the regulatory process. But in all seriousness, yeah, that actually did happen. But that was while he was just a statewide representative in the state of Ohio. Anyway, just FYI, I certainly don't remember, and I don't remember him, but my mom tells me it did happen. Anyway, Sherrod Brown commented on this, and he said, well, geez, now banks can't do their fair lending analytics, and the CFP doesn't care about fair lending, which the truth of the matter was they removed these tools because they were not able to handle the new data elements that kicked in for 2018. So now there are a number of other tools that are available out there, and certainly those of you that are in fair lending are very familiar, and I'm sure you've got your own methodology to make sure you've got all this information analyzed. But there is a great summary of all of these threshold changes actually from the NCUA's website. Now, even if you're not a credit union, it's a good document because guess what? HMDA is the same for everybody. Whether you're a national bank or a credit union or even a non-bank lender, there's some threshold differences, of course, but the generalized reporting requirements are the same. So if you're a regulated institution, bank or credit union, click on that. It's a good summary, even though it was issued by the NCUA. Got a few screenshots here from some of the quick reference guides, as well as the small entity compliance guide, which, by the way, I don't know why they call it the small entity compliance guide. HMDA is not that much different for small lenders as it is for large institutional ones. We'll get into some of the data reporting differences for small reporters. But just because you're a small bank, you may be reporting everything with regard to HMDA, but that's just my own personal opinion here. So even large banks, the largest of the big, Wells and Citibank would get good information from the small entity compliance guide. Anyway, there are some good flow charts in here that you could utilize to determine, hey, do we have to file under HMDA? Does this thing even apply to us? And not going to ask you to take out your magnifier or your cheaters to go through this, but good resources available that you can go through a number of questions to determine, well, what do we have to do with regard to this? So they have the transactional coverage as well as institutional coverage. Katie, what you got?
Okay, 200 HELOCs we collect in 2022 and report in 2023. The 2 previous years would be 2021 and 2020, correct?
That's right. Yep, it's the previous 2 calendar years. So if we're sitting here talking in 2022, you're going to look at what you did in 21 and 20. And you're simply going to look at your submission file or your system of record and say, well, how many did we have? And if you exceeded the threshold for either closed or open, boom, you're in for 2022. And if it's your first go round and only now did you trip the threshold for the last 2 years, then you have to commence collecting the information in 2022 to report in 23. But this is where these flowcharts become very helpful. So make sure you download those. They're in all the documents here. Take a look at that and make sure you know what you have to do and when you have to do it. So they do make it pretty easy, in my opinion. All right. So there are some time frames here. So remember, a lot of these HMDA requirements kicked in with what we call the 2018 final rule. And this timeline was addressed to articulate some of those timeframes here. And this may help with the question that was just asked as far as what you've got to do and when you have to do it. So I might take a look at that as well. That link is in that HMDA page from the CFPB that I referenced earlier. Now, one of the more important things that 2018 rule and some of the later amendments and final rules by the CFPB did was introduce what we call a partial exemption. Now, got to be very clear on this. When we say partial exemption, we don't mean you're either exempt from HMDA or you're full in. You either have to report under HMDA or you don't. And that's what I call what the CFPB calls that institutional coverage. So if you go back to some of those flow charts here, you see institutional coverage. And this means, is your bank covered under HMDA at all? Do you have to even worry about it at all? And if you end up in the red and no, then all this stuff is a moot point to you and you can hang up. But if you're in, so in other words, you pass the test in your institution, excuse me, your bank is covered by HMDA, then you have to ask the next question, well, what do we then have to report? Do we have to report closed-end loans? Do we have to report lines of credit? And the two are distinct, meaning you may have to report closed-end loans, but not open-end, or vice versa. Now, I told you I'd spent a lot of time working for Key Bank up in Cleveland, and at Key, we were much more of a line of credit lender than we were closed-end. Now, we had to submit a LAR with both because Key is pretty big, but there are banks out there that originate a whole lot more HELOCs than they do closed-end mortgages. Maybe they just do closed-end as an accommodation to customers, that type of thing. So you may have crossed over the threshold for open-end, but not closed-end, or vice versa, or both, or maybe neither. And that's why these flow charts become very helpful to you with regard to that. So I've got all of the details as far as how that works here, including the final rule that you can click on and give a read. If you're really bored someday and you want to go and read the statute, I've got the link to that here at the top of page 40 if you want to give it a read. But the final rule is really the best document to give a read. But I have summarized this here on the bottom of page 40 for that partial exemption. Now, partial exemption means that you're still reporting under HMDA for those closed or open-end lines of credit. But in some cases, you may not have to report everything, all the data fields, depending on your particular situation. So go through these pages here, give it a read, and see whether you may be covered. Now, I have taken a couple provisions of the Small Entity Compliance Guide and put them on the page here. So you can download that document and find these sections for yourselves. But I put a couple of notes on here, and I put that little star on the page indicating that if you are what they call a low volume filer, as defined by these rules here, you still have to report information about those loans or lines, but not everything. So there are 26 data points that you don't have to submit. You don't have to collect, you don't have to report, because you are a low volume filer. So you can find this information in that Small Entity Compliance Guide, but as we go through some of the data points in the remainder of the time that we have, you'll see that I put that little star on some of the pages. So if you are a low volume filer, when we come across one of those with the star, you're going to say, oh yeah, that's one of the ones that our institution doesn't have to report because we are a low volume filer. So hopefully that is somewhat helpful. Now, later in the Small Entity Compliance Guide, no matter who you are, if you have crossed the threshold for institutional coverage, so you have to report something under HMDA, we all have to report these elements here on page 49. So you don't qualify for that partial exemption here. Even if you do, you still have to report all of this information on page 42 and on page 49 of the Small Entity Compliance Guide. Good news is this is basically the information that we've had to report under HMDA for years and years, essentially since the 90s, subject to some modifications as the years have gone by. But really the information on page 41 that I have here, these are the new data elements for the most part that kicked in 2018. And there's a recognition that if you're a low volume filer, you don't really have the resources oftentimes to augment your systems to collect all this new stuff that kicked in, thus you don't have to record it. So hopefully that is a nice differentiator for you to determine, hey, we do qualify for that partial exemption, so we have to file what now? What are we exempt from? That's where you would go. Now, I've got those indicators also. I put those little stars in that reference chart that I indicated earlier. So you will see where I put screenshots of some of those fields in as we go through some of the hot spots in HMDA. And if there's a star there, you know that this is an optional data field. So the LEI, like we talked about before, this is one that's low or small volume filers don't have to report if they don't want to. Can they? Yes. Now, if you choose to file it, if you're a small volume filer, then you have to file it for every loan on HMDA to which it's applicable. So you can't pick and choose what you choose to file here, but basically the star means it's an optional data field. And same thing for over there on the right, the NA, and how you would report that on your submission file when you choose not to report it because you're a small volume filer. So all this is covered in the FIG and on those reference charts there as well. So hopefully this is very useful information for you. Again, it's not just coming from me. The CFPB does a great job of providing a lot of resources that I've hopefully provided you useful links to get that information. Again, more than happy to help. You know, we're coming down to the wire here in 5 weeks, and it sounds like a long way away. But those of you that are involved in HMDA, like I have been for years, know that that's not a lot of time, honestly, if things are really going wrong. All right. So I've just got some screenshots of some of this useful information and the reference guide to make things a little bit easier. Now, always remember that this partial exemption is ultimately taken at the data point level, so that particular field. So from a mapping perspective and operationally, you have to identify, well, on the system and on our submission file, where does that go? And what do we have to put and what do we have to leave out, that type of thing. So you may have an exempt data point that consists of multiple data fields. So I'm kind of getting very technical and in the weeds here, but there are a lot of fields. So for example, you look on the right-hand side of the page, you've got the property address. Well, you've got the street address and the city and the zip. Multiple fields that comprise that particular data point. Credit score has the score itself, and then also the name of the AUS, or whether it's FICO or whatever the case may be. Two different fields comprising that data point. So when I say you're exempt from certain data points, that may mean, or it does mean, I should say, multiple additional data fields. So as an example, and I liberally borrowed this little graphic here from a webinar that the CFPB put down a couple of years ago in conjunction with the ABA. And this is out there in the public domain, so I'm not violating anybody's copyright. But for example, the partial exemption means that when you take that exemption at the data point level, that all of those additional data fields that comprise that data point are exempt. So when you are exempted from the credit score, you're exempt from all those fields that are listed at the bottom. And the good news is you can determine what all those are through these FIGs, the filing instruction guides, and other reference charts here. But understand that you may be exempt from a lot of stuff, not just the data point. All right, so some of the, in short, the completion guidelines as far as if you're exempt, how do you report that? Whether you actually record the word exempt in the field, and the answer is yes, you do. But when you put that in there, make sure you capitalize the E and have all the others in lowercase. Don't put all caps exempt or all small exempt. Yes, it is that picky. It is that detailed here. So the numeric fields with 4 ones and leave some of the free form fields blank. These are all in the instructions, by the way, so it's not just coming from me, but I just thought I would summarize that for you. So here's just an overall reminder of those data fields that you can take that partial exemption and their codes. So hopefully this makes it a little bit easier on you to understand what you have to do if you are one of those institutions that can take advantage of that. There are tools available for this from the FFIEC as well, so they work together with the CFPB. But I've got their webpage where you can get this over there on the bottom left. And then you can download an Excel field. They've got macros, which you may have to go through ID or your IT department to activate. Because as we all know, some viruses sometimes get hidden in macros, but these are pretty clean. I've taken a look and used them for years myself, but they're good resources available to make sure that you get your submission file in order. Okay, so we've got an awful lot of information. I've got, roughly 70 pages here to go over in 35 minutes. So that's a lot of information in short order here. What I've done, and number one, and I've said this many times before, I would rather give you more information than not enough, with the goal of take a look at it later and see if you have any issues or questions around any of these that you can send me an email and ask about. And I've hopefully made these pages easy enough to understand that you don't need me to explain what some of these things mean. But I've essentially chosen the information that is frequently problematic. So a lot of the gray areas, a lot of the common problems that I've seen over the years of doing this type of work that regulators report back on, a lot of sources of information that I've kind of condensed into this presentation here. So obviously I can't talk about everything, nor would you want me to try in 35 minutes. But I put a lot of the critical factors on here. And if I don't cover the hotspot that you're curious about, feel free to ask away. Katie will interrupt me and feel free to send me an email later. All right, so HMDA, of course, involves reporting of applications as that term is defined. And to this day, the CFPB has not aligned the definition of an application with TRID. And you say, well, geez, that would certainly be easy. They would just say, hey, if you get these 6 pieces of information, it's an application under HMDA, just like it is under TRID. Well, they have purposely begged off on doing that, and they've left the application definition as is. It very closely parallels that in Reg B, which means it's some sort of request or written for a covered loan, meaning covered under HMDA, made in accordance with your procedures. You can make up your own definition for an application. Now, a word of caution, because this is a what should I say, a common issue that a lot of borrowers have. You have to make sure that you don't contrive your definition of a HMDA reportable application to make it easier on the compliance department. You should match your definition of an application to what your bank actually does. And that sounds simple and it sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised what's going on out there. And I don't mean to poke at anybody out there, but some of the more common regulatory problems is banks not reporting applications on their HMDA laws that they should. And you get criticized by your regulator. So work very closely with lenders, say, hey, what information are we collecting from these applicants to actually start to make a credit decision? HMDA is all about reporting credit decisions. So that's why you report applications. So once you rise to that level of having information such that you're ready to make a credit decision. So we're going to grant the request, we're going to originate, we're going to deny, we're going to send information back. Hey, we've got some, but not everything. So it's incomplete. We're going to approve, but the borrower didn't accept it. Whatever the case may be, whatever that point in time is, just periodically ensure that it matches up with what you're actually reporting. And I'd love to go into another 20-minute discussion of that, but we just don't have the time to that. You may have to report repurchases, depending on what's going on in your institution's activity. Remember that HMDA is all about reporting applications, not just loans, but it does have to be an application for an extension of credit, meaning a new loan, a new debt obligation. What is a new debt obligation? It is a promissory note. So it's a legal obligation. So it's not the mortgage, and it's not disclosures, and it's not a modification, an extension or renewal. In other words, if you're asking yourself, we've got this application here, but it's really an application from a current borrower that wants to modify their loan and lower the rate or do whatever it needs to do. And in this day and age, you're probably getting overloaded with requests for some sort of help because of the pandemic here. Guess what? Applications for modifications are never HMDA reportable, never have been, and they're not now. They're only reportable if you accept an application for what will eventually end up to be a new extension of credit evidenced by a legal obligation. That's not new, by the way, and that's not just pandemic guidance. It's the way HMDA has always been. But even though you collect all the information in connection with the modification, which, by the way, you should not be collecting GMI and demographic information in connection with a modification. That's a problem I see a lot of banks come in, because they're not HMDA reportable, nor are the requirements to collect GMI under Reg B applicable to modifications. So make sure you're not making that mistake. What about pre-quals and pre-approvals? This is one of those issues that continues to trouble lenders all the time. And I always start with a very simple statement, and that is, it doesn't matter what your bank calls it. It matters what the HMDA regulation defines it. So whether it's a pre-approval or pre-qualification depends on what HMDA's definition of those terms are, not what your bank calls it. And I've run into this all the time. What you call a pre-qual is actually a pre-approval under HMDA, and therefore HMDA reportable. You're not reporting because you say, hey, it's a pre-qual, and HMDA doesn't require reporting of pre-quals. Well, that's just what you're calling it. So you have to step aside from what your bank calls these things, because those are really marketing terms, or maybe just product titles. And you have to make sure you understand what you're doing pursuant to the HMDA regulation. Works the other way as well. What you may call a pre-approval is actually just a pre-qual, and you don't have to report it in the first place. So maybe you're overdoing it. And where the rubber meets the road here is in the definition of a pre-approval. And again, I'm going to be skipping through a lot of this information pretty quickly. So if you want me to back up, please feel free, and I'll be happy to discuss something further here. But remember, to be a HMDA reportable pre-approval, it must meet the definition in this regulation. So it's going to be for a closed-end home purchase loan that's not secured by a multifamily dwelling. So it's already more limited than all of the HMDA reporting applications would be. But there are two very important requirements that need to be met in order to be a HMDA reportable pre-approval. Number one, your bank, your institution has to have a formal program for them. And when we say formal, we mean you have to have written policies and procedures, and there's a process that you can consult to understand how your bank does this. In other words, ad hoc pre-approvals are not reportable. And when I say ad hoc, maybe I'm a really good customer of your bank. I got a lot of money at your institution, and you don't do pre-approvals as a practice at your bank, but I come to you and I say, Katie, you're my personal banker here, and I know you'll do a pre-approval letter for me since I'm a really good customer. I'm thinking about inquiring about this home, and the real estate agent won't even talk to me unless I have an approval letter here. So can you give me one of those? And she says, for you, I will, because you're special. Just ask anybody. Well, you get the point here. That would not be HMDA reportable. Therefore, you would not collect the GMI for that. You have to have a formal program for those. And that, as a matter of fact, kind of knocks out, 90+% of the pre-approvals that most banks do, because not many banks have formal programs to do these things anymore. So just because you do one or two doesn't mean they're reportable. So that's number one. Number two, when you do a pre-approval pursuant to a formal program, because both of these criteria must be met, you're going to give me a binding written commitment. Now, we always have trouble with those words, binding commitment. In other words, is binding, does that mean that you promise that you're going to give me a loan regardless of what happens? No matter what happens between the time I get this commitment letter and the scheduled close, nothing can go wrong that would change our mind and we would choose not to make you that loan. Of course not. And truth be told, there is no such thing as a 100% binding commitment. In other words, if I show up at the closing table in a beautiful shade of orange, got my orange jumpsuit on and my hands are zip tied behind my back, and I'm accompanied by a couple sheriff's deputies because I was just arrested yesterday for some crime, are you going to give me the loan? No. But hey, you gave me a binding commitment. Well, no such thing here. So as a result, this has been a problem issue for years, and the FFIEC, as far back as the 90s, issued some FAQs, and I will have the link for you here in a page to come, but they talk about some of these conditions, because in the end, every commitment that you issue is conditional on something. If nothing else, it's conditional on the applicant surviving for enough time to come to the closing table, right? Or still being employed, or not going out and maxing out all their credit cards. Katie, what you got?
Sure. For a pre-approval request that becomes a completed application, is the application date the date of the pre-approval request, or the request became an application under TRID?
Under TRID, which is TRID. Now, we got two things going on here, and I'll address TRID first. So when it crosses over that line as a TRID application, that's when all those requirements to issue the LE and all that kind of good stuff kick in. So don't worry about HMDA when you're thinking TRID, but if you're talking HMDA, if it's a reportable pre-approval, and if you are an institution that reports pre-approvals, because remember, you have a reportable or you have a formal program for that, that's the date you're going to put on there, the date of the pre-approval request. Now, if you're a bank that does ad hoc pre-approvals and you just do them, just for good customers or every once in a while, not formalized, so you're not reporting pre-approvals, you would only have to report that situation when it crosses the line from pre-approval to application, in which case you'd report the application date, because you don't report pre-approvals. Hopefully that's what you're getting at. Okay, but my point was that the FFIEC has differentiated between what they call customary conditions versus credit conditions. And I would love to get into a 20-minute discussion on that. Don't have the time to do it, but I'll have the link to do that, to find that later on, as well as some of the FAQs. Remember that HMDA is what I say, mostly collateral based, mostly refers to the commercial side of the coin, because a non-dwelling secured commercial loan may or may not be HMDA reportable depending on the purpose. But there's two ways to think about coverage, and I'll present both of them, and you can think about which one makes more sense to you. The first way to do it is to first think, well, is this loan primarily consumer or commercial purpose? Now, you use the Reg Z and the RESPA thought process to make this determination. In other words, would this be a loan covered by Reg Z or not? And if the answer is, well, yeah, it would be, then it's considered a consumer purpose loan under HMDA. They kind of borrowed that analysis here for HMDA purposes. So you can use the same thought process, fortunately. So if it's a consumer purpose loan and it's secured by a dwelling. If you have those two elements in place, consumer purpose and secured by a dwelling, HMDA reportable all day long. Doesn't matter what that borrower is going to do with the money. Buy a house, improve a house, buy a car, pay off credit card debt, HMDA reportable because it's consumer purpose and secured by a dwelling. If, on the other hand, it's a commercial purpose, it's only HMDA reportable if it's either a home purchase, home improvement, or refi, as those terms are defined. So if you have a commercial purpose application, it's secured by a dwelling. So maybe it's a 100-unit apartment complex, or it's a home builder, for example, and they're securing it by the inventory homes. But the purpose is not home purchase, improvement, or refi. Maybe it's to buy inventory for my business here. It's not HMDA reportable because you underwrite those differently. And since you don't really utilize any of the borrower's characteristics, hopefully you don't on the consumer side, but remember, it's all about your credit decisions. And they're underwritten and considered differently, therefore they're not reportable. So use that Reg Z standard, start with the consumer versus commercial. Now, the other way to look at it here is, and we're of course getting to what is a covered transaction. Remember that all loans, or I should say all applications for home purchase, home improvement, and refinancings are HMDA reportable regardless of whether they're consumer or commercial purpose. So it's just another way of saying, consider those two categories in reverse. Rather than asking yourself, is it consumer or commercial first, ask yourself whether it's a home purchase, home improvement, or refi. Now, this little chart at the bottom of the page indicates those two standards here. So you see left and right, consumer, commercial, and then you see those three categories, purposes, I should say, down at the bottom here. Now, we'll talk about the coding here in just a moment. But you see category number 4 under consumer loans. This is your home equity loan. So any purpose other than purchase, refi, home improvement. So if I come in and say, Katie, I want to borrow $20,000 to pay off my credit card debt. And she says, well, we need to take a mortgage on your house. And I give her that and apply for that loan. That's going to be a 4 on the consumer side because it's consumer purpose, but it's not to purchase or improve a home or to refinance a loan. That is other, so home equity. But you don't see category number 4, and that was the first question we had this morning. Would a commercial home equity loan per se be HMDA reporting? The answer no, because there's no category for it. So either way you look at it, you're considering whether it's consumer versus commercial purpose and or whether it meets one of those 3 standards. So I've got the definition here for each of these 3. Not going to go into great detail because they haven't changed in years and years. So hopefully you're pretty familiar with that. If you're not, happy to talk about it either now or later. But I do want to mention what's at the bottom of page 59 here, and that refers to TRID. One of the big problems is loan purpose under HMDA is not the same as that under TRID. So for example, under HMDA, you have a home purchase loan. If I come to Katie and I said, I want to buy house A, but I'm actually going to give you a mortgage on a different home, maybe my primary dwelling. So I want to buy this vacation home, it's out on the coast type of thing. And Katie says, well, we'd rather just take a mortgage on your primary, your main house. And I say, sure. So I'm buying house A, securing that loan by house B. Under HMDA, what is that? Home purchase loan. It meets the definition. Secured by a dwelling made to purchase a dwelling, yes. Even though it's a different dwelling, home purchase under HMDA. On TRID, however, and what you put on your LE and your CD, that is not a purchase. They use the term purchase rather than home purchase. That is actually a home equity loan. Because under TRID, the loan has to be secured by what is called the subject property. And the subject property means the one that is, you're taking a lien on. The loan or has to buy the subject property. Well, it's different. Have to be to buy house A, secured by house B, or I'm sorry, secured by house A to be a purchase under TRID. And that's very confusing, and a lot of lenders get this wrong. So I just wanted to point out that one there. Home improvement definition here hasn't changed. Improve the home or the land. Doesn't matter how much of the proceeds are used for that purpose. If I'm going to use $100 to fix my front gate, and the loan is $10,000, and I'm going to use most of it to do other things like pay off other debts, it's still a home improvement loan. It doesn't have to be primarily home improvement. That's a common mistake a lot of banks make. Refi. Two parts to this. Number one, is it a refi under Reg Z? Remember, we got done talking about, well, it has to be a new obligation to be HMDA reportable here. So yeah, we're talking about a new obligation to be a refi. Modifications aren't refis because there's no new promissory note. Therefore, they're not HMDA reportable under refis. They're not HMDA reportable at all. Now, it's got to be by the same borrower to be HMDA reportable as well. And if both the loan that's going away and the new loan are secured by liens on a dwelling, regardless of the original purpose, guess what? HMDA reportable as a refi. Now, there's an FAQ that I've linked to, and remember, you can click on that and see this for yourself here. For a line of credit, if it's dwelling secured and it satisfies and replaces another one, is that line reported as a refi? And the answer is no. And that seems to contradict the definition above. And I fully agree that this is confusing, but this is the case only for those particular lines of credit. So understand that little tweak to the rules that's in there and make sure you're not reporting those. Now, you may read the HMDA regulation, you come across something called the coverage definition, and you say, well, if it's not a covered refi, it shouldn't be reported. And the coverage definition talks about the one that's going away as a home purchase loan, and both the one going away and the new one are secured by first liens. And that seems to be a much narrower definition for coverage. So which one is right? The one that you've got on this page or the one that's here? And the answer is the one that's here. That is the definition of a refi. This coverage definition merely is to consider, used to consider whether your bank reports under HMDA in the first place. And remember, we have that 200 threshold of covered lines of credit to determine whether you report, whether you're over that wall. This is how you count whether you have more than 200. But once you're over the wall, doesn't matter. You know you're covered by HMDA and you're going to report them all. And that distinction is listed in the FAQs there, where that coverage definition is not relevant in determining whether to report a particular transaction. It's relevant in determining whether your institution reports under HMDA in the first place. Now, in 2018, there was a new code issued. It was 3.1 and 3.2. I've seen a lot of banks get this wrong. Cash out refi. And you say, well, what is a cash out refi? Good news is it's pretty much what you expect. So I come in and I say, hey, Katie, I want to borrow $10,000 on the collateral of my house to pay off my credit card debt. And she says, well, we already have your first mortgage here. Why don't we do a refi and we'll up the principal amount by 10 grand and give you some cash out. Well, great. That's a refi. We have a new promissory note reflecting the new amount. So you say, well, cool. That's a cash out refi. So that's reported as a cash out refi on the HMDA law, right? Maybe. And the maybe reflects the fact that you have to look to see how your bank underwrites or makes credit decisions regarding refinancing. And what I'm saying is, if you use different underwriting standards, because the loan is a cash out refi versus a non-cash out refi, you use the code 3.2. So in other words, Katie's going to think to herself, would we underwrite that refi differently because it's a cash out deal? What if it was just a straight refi where this guy came to us and said, I've got a mortgage at Wells that I'd like to refi at your bank because you've got better terms? Would we underwrite that the same or differently? If the answer is the same, you do not use the code for cash out refi. Everything is going to be a 3.1. But on the other hand, you say, well, we would underwrite that differently because there's cash out. So maybe different credit scores or different DTIs or whatever the case may be, you have different underwriting standards. Then, but only then would you use that 3.2 cash out refi code. So you've got to work very carefully with operations, with your lenders to say, would you underwrite that differently? Now, the reason for that is the CFPB uses these codes to essentially lump different types of applications together for fair lending analytic purposes. Now, they would like to lump those groups of applications together that you underwrite the same, and they want larger populations, better statistical results. So if you underwrite them the same way, there's no reason to differentiate. Now, most banks underwrite purchase loans differently from improvement or home equity loans and so forth. So that's why there's those codes. But understand that very careful distinction in the cash out refi section. All right. Let's say the loan meets more than one of these definitions, and the cash out refi is the primary example of this. Because if it's a cash out refi, does that make does that meet the definition of a refi? Well, yeah, new loan, both secured by a lien on a dwelling, good to go. But let's say I'm going to use that cash out for home improvement purposes. I'm going to fix the fence around my house or roof, whatever the case may be. So it's also a home improvement loan. Well, which do you report it as? And the answer is, for a cash out refi, you're going to report it as a cash out refi if you underwrite differently, or just a refi over a home improvement loan. Now, this is important because this changed in 2018. In the old days, and I mean prior to 2018, you would have reported a cash out refi for home improvement purposes as a home improvement loan. And that is reflected by the numbers in the chart. And these are the codes on the HMDA law. So home improvement loan is always going to be code 2 on the law, where a refi used to be a code 3. Now, this was a hierarchy, 1, 2, 3, 4. So home improvement trumped refi. 2018 rolled around, they flipped them. And that's why in the hierarchy, you see 1, 3, 2, 4. Because they say, you know what, we would rather consider that a refi for analytics purposes rather than home improvement. So they flipped it. Now, this is important because it's confusing. 3 never comes before 2. Well, they didn't change the coding because that would have been an operational nightmare and caused all sorts of IT problems and so forth. But they changed the guidance and they changed the rule. So remember that refi trumps home improvement if that application meets both standards here, but they did not change the numbering. So that is a common error that I've seen over the time since the 2018 changes. Just got a little notation here about commercial applications that are frequently missed. So some of the pain points that regulators will look for on the commercial side. So take a look at that when you've got some time. The exemptions have not changed for HMDA, whether we, lot loans because there's no dwelling, servicing rights, $500, that type of thing, that has not changed. Remember, modifications are not extensions of credit. They're not new extensions of credit. Even if you fully underwrite that applicant, you don't collect the GMI because you're not going to report it under HMDA, nor is it required under Reg B, and it's not HMDA reportable. And they also do not count towards the thresholds, either under either, I'll get it straight here, closed end or the open end rules. Katie, what you got?
Okay, HMDA, report AUS system and results if one was used for a loan application initially, but application changed to a loan program that did not use the AUS.
Mm-hmm. All right, so the question is, you originally used an AUS, automated underwriting system, so maybe use DU or something like that when I initially applied for a loan, but midstream I changed the program, or I didn't qualify, well, it depends on the situation. Let's use the example that I applied, you ran AUS, and then we changed the program. And we changed that because maybe I changed my mind. So would you put the AUS result because later on, when you finally underwrote me, you like that? You didn't use AUS, so would you report it? The answer is no. No, because the credit decision that you are reporting on HMDA did not utilize an AUS finding, right? Yeah, if that's true, you don't report it because that would be an inaccurate report or a data field. Just because you ran AUS at some point in time, but it had nothing to do with the credit decision, you would not report it. Okay, now that would change if you said, well, the AUS said you wouldn't qualify, so we're going to change you to this program. So that's more of a counteroffer scenario. We'll get into that here a little bit later in the 10 minutes that we have. Apologies for that. But remember, those modifications aren't reportable. If you do business in New York, you have those CMAs there, the consolidation, extension, and mod agreements. They have determined that those are new obligations and therefore should be reportable. Long story around that. I won't bore you with that. Remember temporary financing. This didn't change in 2018, fortunately, but continues to cause problems. Temporary means it's a loan that's intended to be replaced by more permanent financing later. And if that's the condition around that loan, you would not report that temporary loan, regardless of the term. So we can get into a lot more detail here, but ask yourself that very simple question. Don't overcomplicate it. You'll be okay. Then ag loans. If the primary purpose of the loan is anything agriculturally related, it's exempt. And that dates all the way back to 1994 when this thing came into being. There's a very strong farming lobby that got themselves exempted here. And they said, you don't underwrite farming loans the same as you would a typical home purchase loan. While mostly true, that exemption has stuck over the years. So if your determination is the funds are used primarily for ag purposes, even though there may be the farmhouse securing a loan, it's not HMDA reportable. Or if it's a loan secured by a dwelling located on a farm, and that real estate is used primarily for ag purposes, it's out. It's not HMDA reportable. Very important to understand that. So any dwelling secured loans or line of credit for primarily ag purposes are out. And all this information is in the Getting It Right guide, by the way. But I've got some examples of temporary financing, what would be reportable and what wouldn't be. I need to skip through that. I've got some scenarios and kind of some quick reference guides for you that hopefully will help you in that. But I do want to get to a couple points here. And builders are always problematic for a lot of lenders. And there was a clarification, fortunately, by the CFPB, where they said if it's a construction only loan or line, and it's temporary if that is extended exclusively construct, I'll get it right. I'm trying to talk fast and I'm starting to trip over myself here, a dwelling for sale. So home builder, that is not HMDA reportable because really it's not underwritten the same as a typical purchase loan here. You don't have to worry about those loans or lines that you may extend or warehouse line for building here. So I've got the examples and a little more clarification on the ag purpose. Now this is a case-by-case determination, by the way. Now you can standardize that in some of your coding in your LOS, in your systems, loan origination system, to make it easier, but understand that exemption is in the rule. I've also actually quoted chapter and verse. I said I'm not going to do that, but I'm not going to read it to you, but this is particularly helpful to make that determination as far as what agricultural means. And believe it or not, I've got a lot of questions lately around, I'm in a state that has recently legalized hemp or recreational marijuana, and I'm in Arizona, and that's one of the states we just did that. But I spend summers in Oregon, and that's like the hemp capital. And man, I don't know if you've ever been around a hemp field, but it stinks. It smells terrible. And a lot of vineyards are being turned into hemp fields. I guess it's more profitable. It was kind of a shame, but I digress. So if you've got a question as far as what agricultural purpose means, here's a comment that you can go to figure that out. All right, so let's get through that here. I've got some examples, and again, there's a lot of helpful information for you, and hopefully that is useful to you. Definition of a dwelling. This is something that, geez, we could spend a half hour on, and I've been saying that a lot, haven't I? We could spend 20 minutes on this, a half an hour on that. We truly could. But the good news here is the CFPB did not change the definition of dwelling when the final rules in 2018 were issued. So basically, a dwelling is a residential structure, whether or not attached to real property. So a mobile home without land is a dwelling. So it's not a TRID loan because there's no real estate, right? There's no dirt. And remember, TRID equals dirt, but it may be HMDA reportable. So don't conflate those two and don't get confused. Now, it doesn't matter if it's the primary dwelling, a vacation home, a multi-unit apartment building. So it's not a 1-to-4. A lot of people get that Reg Z definition confused and they say, well, it's not a 1-to-4, it's a multifamily. Well, it's still HMDA reportable. And on the commercial side, you'll see that a lot. Now, what if it's an RV, travel trailer, RV, that type of thing? Remember the old Chris Farley thing? I live in a van down by the river. Well, that is not a dwelling, even if, remember his name? Matt Foley, motivational speaker. He lives in a van down by the river. That's his residence. And if he wants to, refinance his van loan, does that make it a HMDA reportable loan? No. But guess what? It may be covered by Reg Z. So this is another one of those confusing points. The definition of dwelling means something different in HMDA than it does in Reg Z. And these houseboats and travel trailers may be dwellings under Reg Z, but they're not under HMDA. Now, to get this straight, in the Getting It Right guide, one of the HMDA documents that I think is most useful is this little chart. So they have what is and what isn't a dwelling, because they've been inundated with questions over the years as far as, is this a dwelling? Is this not? This is where you go. And this is where, I mean, we can have a long discussion on it, but want to call your attention to the bottom of this page, a strange quirk in the HMDA rule. And I really don't know why the CFPB did this, but they say that if, for example, I come in and I say, Katie, I've got a great opportunity. I want to buy this piece of property, and it's going to be land only. That's the only collateral. So Katie's thinking to herself, well, okay, it's not secured by a dwelling. It's just a vacant piece of land. And I say, well, I'm going to turn it into a mobile home park. So I'm going to have all the utilities and all that stuff installed, and I'm going to have the various lots in that mobile home park rented out to people that they can bring their mobile homes on it, and I'll collect rent. And Katie thinks, well, still the collateral is only the vacant piece of land right now. There will be mobile homes sitting on that land eventually, but we're not going to take a lien on those mobile homes because this guy doesn't own them. So that loan's not secured by a dwelling, is it? Well, legally it's not, but guess what? Under HMDA, it is HMDA reportable. And you say, that's crazy. There's no dwelling. Well, crazy is, as HMDA says, and then HMDA says that you report that as secured by a dwelling if it's secured by a land or a piece of land that is a mobile home park. Now, this doesn't count for condos or co-ops or anything else, only manufactured homes. That's the PC term to use for mobile homes anymore. But understand that and think to yourself, is that a type of deal that our bank would do? And if the answer is yes, we may have one, or that's possible, make sure you understand that that would be HMDA reportable. So I've got some information around, different medical facilities and nursing homes and dormitories. That's normally where a lot of these questions come around. Manufactured homes as well, modulars, clarifications around multifamily. The good thing is that it now makes sense. So if a loan is secured by multiple, let's say, single family dwellings, so you have a loan to maybe a landlord or something, and they want to give you the collateral of 2 single family homes. Previously, the CFPB says that is secured by a multifamily dwelling. Well, no, it's not. It's secured by multiple single family dwellings, but not a multifamily dwelling. The good news is the CFPB reversed their position. Now, this has been the law for 3 years now, but in case you still get this confused, it now makes common sense. It would not be secured by a multifamily dwelling. If it's a mixed use property, you make the determination as to what its primary use is. Is it primarily a dwelling, or is it primarily a store or a warehouse, that type of thing? And you've got the standards there to see how you would make that determination. All right. There's the broker rule, which essentially says that whoever makes that final credit decision is responsible for reporting. So if you don't make the credit decision, and we're talking about things like delegated underwriting, well, you don't report it on your HMDA log, but a word of caution. Now you say, well, we don't use our criteria. We're using maybe the investor's criteria, like Fannie's, to make that credit decision. So we don't report. Oh no, you do report. It doesn't matter whose criteria you're using, you made the decision, therefore you report. So just understand how that works and don't try to offload that responsibility. But if you follow with 100% certainty what that investor says, okay, I will do that, then you wouldn't report. But that's pretty rare, so don't get hung up on that. Now, I've got a lot of examples of that you can take a look at. Now, we are about out of time, and I sincerely apologize that we aren't going to cover the last 41 pages here. But, hey, I'm going to blame Katie. I'm going to blame you for that, because you didn't give me the 3 hours that I needed to cover this stuff. So it's totally, of course, I'm kidding. But there's a couple.
Take the blame.
Yeah, give me a minute or two just to go over some of the things that I would invite you to pay attention to. But in the end, and be sure to criticize me to the moon and back for not going through this information. I truly want to know if there's something you didn't cover. But this is where the pain points are. And this is where a lot of the information is that banks typically get wrong. So I put a lot of explanatory information, but really around action taken is where I see a lot of the problems. So pay attention to the withdrawn code, pay attention to the incomplete. Be sure to standardize your reporting in your institution here. And I'm not going to run my mouth any further here because I've got about 1 minute till, and I want to say that I ended early. So Katie, I'm going to toss it back to you.
Sounds great. Carl, thank you so much for your presentation. I know based on the chats I received, the questions I received, everyone's very appreciative of it. As we mentioned before, we'll be sure to send out the PowerPoint deck again, as well as the link to the recording and Carl's email address. Another huge thank you to Doug and Data Center for their sponsorship, co-sponsorship on this. It's been great. And we hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Carl, thank you. We'll talk to everybody later. Bye.
You bet. Thanks much.
Thank you.